Mr. Lear, when did you first hear the name Gary Coleman, or when did you first see him?
I had seen him in Little Rascals, didn't know he had been cast in it. Just said, get that kid in my office right away. Well, it couldn't be had in my office right away because he had gone home. So we called him back. And I met him in my office for the first time when he had been called back. And by then, I think we also had him under contract.
When you met him, you also met the parents. Any recollection of how they were reacting to this?
I don't remember the parents. Now, maybe that's another way of saying, something about the spark of Gary Coleman. If you were with Gary Coleman, you weren't looking about. There was nobody else in the room with you.
So you meet Gary Coleman. You instinctively think he has some star quality and even human qualities. But you don't think the Little Rascals was the vehicle, or it had already been rejected. So how did you move him into the variety of shows that you were responsible for at that point?
I just introduced him, made sure everybody knew how much I cared about him. And I can't remember who the writers were who were assigned to thinking of something that might include Gary Coleman. And I don't remember really creatively, I had very little to do. I had nothing to do with the development of his relationship, the show itself and his relationship.
But he had a bit part on Good Times. He was on the Jeffersons in sort of small roles.
We used him to save scenes in a number of shows, or to save episodes in a number of shows, where he came in and just brought daylight.
So saving scenes is you have a marginally good show and you need something to put it over the top.
Well, saving scenes is the show is working, but if there was a moment where somebody could come in the door and ask for something, or for some good reason, and walk out having delivered several laughs, all these shows were full of that.
Tell us a little bit about it as a creative producer. What was it about his look, his smile, his demeanor that really made you think he could be something special?
Well, Gary Coleman, the instant you saw Gary Coleman, I mean, he was cute, he was adorable. He had a wonderful personality. But kids tend to that, generally. Gary Coleman also had a spark of humanity. He was a little glory. It's so hard to express. He spilled humanity along with the cuteness and the sweetness. You wanted to pick him up and hug him, and that wasn't true of every cute kid.
When you say in that first meeting or those first meetings you discovered the on-camera uniqueness of Gary Coleman, how did that manifest itself? Does any story come to you from that?
Not so much stories as, it's just walking into a room and shaking a hand, and a presence is there. It's just, he was a presence. I didn't spend the kind of time that would deliver some stories, per se. My story is simply seeing him, falling in love with him, and quite understanding so with the country. Was
the reaction from the audience as quick as it was when you first saw him? Was it a hit from the beginning?
As I recall, it was a hit from the beginning. What I know for sure, because I was there, was that the initial audience reacted exactly the same way anybody ever reacted to Gary Coleman. So I think Gary Coleman carried different strokes, certainly to get it off the ground, before the country understood, well, there's Conrad Bain again, a glorious actor, comedic actor. And I've just forgotten the boy's name, his brother.
Todd Bridges.
Todd.
What was the uniqueness of Diff'rent Strokes? You say he carried the show, but it was unique at that particular time that two African Americans would be adopted by an upscale white man to raise them. Was there controversy in putting that show on the air?
You know, I'd love to say I had a lot to do with it. I did not have it. It was happening in a corner of the company, and I was thrilled for its success because I adored him. I liked success anyway in the company that worked together. But I wasn't a part of it. I simply wasn't a part of it. We had 6 shows, I think, on the air at that time before Diff'rent Strokes got on, and I was occupied with the other shows.
Why, in your view, he deserves to be remembered fondly and honored in some way by the Museum of Broadcast Communications in Chicago?
If the museum in Chicago was a wall of paintings, you couldn't have a full wall without a picture of Gary Coleman. You know, if it was a road of bricks and each brick was named, you couldn't. He's a part of the history in comedy of the medium.
Going back to the Colgate Comedy Hour, you were writing for Martin and Lewis, and that was one of the most remarkable comedy variety shows of that decade. Even though the Ed Sullivan Show is remembered most by historians, the Colgate Comedy Hour was, from the careers that it launched, was every bit as impressive as the Ed Sullivan Show.
Yeah. Well, the Colgate Comedy Hour, Dean and Jerry, and the other shows, that goes back to a time when, I don't know what percentage, but it wasn't close to 50% of homes had television. So I remember in the years immediately preceding that, we used to go over to somebody else's house that had a television because we didn't have it on Tuesday night to see Milton Berle and the Texaco Hour. Just a few years before. It was true too when the Colgate Comedy Hour started, and suddenly I'm writing the Martin and Lewis, Ed Simmons and I, the Dean Martin, Jerry Lewis Colgate Comedy Hour. Everybody didn't have a television set, so people used to go on Sunday nights to watch Dean and Jerry. And Monday morning, that expression around the water cooler came about because in offices everywhere, where people had a moment together socially around a water cooler, they were talking about, did you see Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis last night? So those were heady days in the very early days of. That was before when Dean and Jerry went on the air in the Colgate Comedy Hour. That was before they had laid the transatlantic coaxial cable, which allowed shows to be broadcast in real time in the East and shown in the West. So shows that were, produced in the East were shown 3 hours later or delayed 2 days or whatever in those days. And then came the transatlantic. I'll sing that song for you now. We wrote a parody to that song. When the transcontinental coaxial cable is laid, when the transcontinental coaxial cable is laid or made, we'll be there there'll be no more gray kinescopes. We'll be there with our kinefolks. You'll hear those Cucamonga jokes coming to you from Hollywood and Vine Street. We'll be on the run to the land of sun and swimming pools. The dramatic shows will be static shows if they stay. Those fools, my favorite part. Horchachornia, it's California. We'll ride the Super Chief. When the transcontinental coaxial cable is laid. We wrote that 2 days before we were coming west with the Colgate Comedy Hour. Mm-hmm. Standing around Bud Yorkin's piano, Pat Weaver, celebrated name, conceiver of the Colgate Comedy Hour, and Sam Fuller and Pete Barnum and Arthur Penn, great producer who was a stage manager then, John Rich, great director who was a stage manager then. We were all around the piano composing that.
To the average person, your name is synonymous with All in the Family. Mm-hmm. as you look back on your remarkable career, was that the period in your career that you remember most fondly?
I remember yesterday more. It was my golden age of television, but I'm looking at dramatic television today and thinking this is the golden age of dramatic television.
I'd like to get a sense of what prompted you to create People for the American Way.
Well, I'm very happy to talk about that. That's very easy. I was scared as a little boy, 9 years old, by Father Coughlin. My father gave me a crystal radio set, and that's with little headphones, a little crystal, and the little cat's whisker, and you picked up signals on the crystal. And in bed one night, I heard, or afternoon, I don't know, I caught Father Coughlin, who was a priest broadcasting out of Detroit, and viciously anti-FDR, pro-Nazi, pro-Hitler, this is obviously before the war, and viciously anti-Semitic. And as a Jewish 9-year-old kid, it was when I learned that there were people who didn't like me simply because I was born into another religion. So I carried that with me. I was a kid of the Depression. My parents couldn't send me to school, couldn't afford to send me to school. I won a scholarship in the American Legion National Oratorical Contest, speaking about that, speaking about the Constitution and why I loved it so, because it was my protection. All people being equal, justice being equal, religious freedom, et cetera, et cetera. So I always had a nose for the off-center in public religion. And when in 1980 and 1979, the televangelists, the fundamentalists, Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell, Jimmy Swaggart, and so forth, started to proliferate across television, I got scared. I'm scared not just scared for me, scared for my country. This was politics and religion. That was not the way I read my Constitution. And I could hear the hatred, the disunion they were spreading. Anyway, so I set about to do a film called Religion to savage that comedically, the way Padachevsky savaged television when he did Network. And I was on my way to getting that script done when one morning I heard Jimmy Swaggart invite his congregation, or ask his congregation, to pray for the, quote, removal of a Supreme Court justice. That did it. That was my born-again American moment. I told my partners I was stepping out of television. I had to do something. Anyway, what I did was a television spot that just saw an average guy, a factory guy, on a piece of heavy equipment looking straight into a camera and saying that he sits around the kitchen table with his wife and kids. They talk politics and they disagree about everything. And here come ministers on radio and television and in the mail telling us we're good Christians or bad Christians depending on our political point of view. If we agree with them, I agree with them most of the time, he said, I'm a good Christian. But my wife, who I know is a better Christian than I am, doesn't agree with them. He wound up saying, there's got to be something wrong when anybody tells you you're a good or a bad Christian, depending on your political point of view. That's not the American way, he said. So I had this television spot, and sounds crazy, but before I did anything with it, I'd already done it. I realized I had several strikes against me. I'm tilting after the religious right. As a Jewish guy, a kid that I was only about 28 years old, 32 years old, and and I'm from Hollywood. I mean, those are two major strikes against you. So I went to see, I knew Father Hesburgh at Notre Dame, and I went to visit him. And he looked at this spot and he said, it's terrific. He said, mainline church leaders, we have the same problem with all of this that you have, this mixture of politics and religion. That's not good. And then he said, unforgettably, but we also are concerned the way they, what the hell was the, torture Scripture. The fundamentalist torture Scripture. I could never forget that. And he sent me to a half a dozen other mainline church leaders, and they all endorsed it. Some of them were on the, one of them said you have to institutionalize this, form an organization around it. And I like what the guy says at the end when he says, that's not the American way, you ought to call it People for the American Way. So I never sat down to start an organization. It was an act of spontaneous combustion off this piece of, and I ran the spot on a station in DC, because there were only 3 networks, and it ran. In 2 days I was sitting with the young Brian Williams and a couple of other, I was on 2 of the networks on the 7 o'clock news with this spot. And as I say, spontaneous combustion. And today, I couldn't be prouder of it.
Your concern for issues, the way that they were treated, obviously in your comedies shows, you dealt with serious issues. And that also includes what was happening on Diff'rent Strokes with Gary Coleman. I mean, some of the issues, whether it was pedophilia or child molestation or smoking dope. I mean, all of those issues were dealt with by your comedy shows.
What, on Diff'rent Strokes, you're saying? Well, I'll accept that it was my influence. It wasn't my work.
Right. On your other programs, Maude, where you're dealing with abortion and gay rights, and you're dealing with all those issues on all your other shows.
On all the other shows, we were dealing with what people deal with in their lives. We were just reflecting what was going on in our world.
I guess the point I was trying to make and didn't make very well is that because you set a precedent that you could deal with serious issues on comedy shows in the 70s, it opened the door to the producers of Diff'rent Strokes and other shows to deal with serious issues involving a child star talking about, you know, the man at the bicycle shop and pedophilia. I mean, that would have never happened had you not opened the doors for what some people would describe as controversial topics in the 1970s.
Mm-hmm.
Can you speak to the importance of broadcast museums to remember and to chronicle and to explore television's history and its impact on society?
History, the subject of history generally doesn't need me to endorse its worth. So humanity knows how it grew, what preceded this moment. But I wish that there was a way for the present to learn a lot more from the past. Recently, I learned, because I'm working on a memoir, and recently I learned that I was a part of a 1978 Emmy Awards contest. I mean, I just saw that out of something I found in a paper or YouTube or some piece of research. And I looked for and found the 1978 Emmy broadcast. And I had 4 minutes or more to talk before I presented an award. And what I talked about was we were only 3 networks. how the other two networks were competing against their own shows about to be honored and their own stars about to be honored. And they were competing, one with some big King Kong. They both were doing major specials in order to steal audience and ratings from the show that was honoring some of their own people. And so I talked about how far do we have to go for, in this winning and losing. Everything is winning. There's no such thing as succeeding at the level of doing your best. I mean, the other two networks are fighting this network for honoring them. There's something wrong with that. We're teaching and in any event, all I'm trying to point out was there was a time when television gave us much more context. It allowed time for, and people, as a consequence, were not screaming at each other and pretending to be a news broadcast, as we see today. So if there was a way, for the present to take a deep breath and look into the past for what it might learn, it would be, and maybe the museums can find a way to help us do that.
Well, one thing I think is important, and again, this will be my thought, and then you can either agree or disagree, but it took over 100 years for the American movie industry to reach a level of academic exploration so that you can go to 300 universities in the United States, and there will be a film studies course, because the study of film is an important part of the study of culture and what life is like. It is still relatively new to have television courses taught at colleges, with now broadcast museums, more than one in the United States, that gives opportunities to people such as yourself, bona fide pioneers, who really changed the mores of America, changed the viewing habits of America. And the television and those that produce television shows are every bit as important as the great producers and directors of America's great movies. It's going to take more time to raise it to the level, but television is increasingly significant, important part of our lives.
Period.
Thank you
You're
very much.
welcome.